A man was quietly fired after 30 years of sweeping school hallways, until a helicopter landed on the front lawn to restore the dignity the world had stolen from him. Under the soft morning sunlight streaming through the maple trees at the front gates of Stonebridge High, another day began like any other. Students laughed and chattered as they hurried to class. The school bell rang through the crisp air, and everything seemed ordinary. Except something was different today. Something unspoken hung in the air. Something the rushing eyes tried to avoid. Something murmured, but never said aloud. Mr. Thomas Hensley, the elderly black janitor who had worked at the school for over 3 decades, was no longer standing at the hallway corner near the music room with his familiar mop. The echo of his heavy footsteps after school was gone. His toothless smile, which often came with a handful of spare change for students who forgot their lunch money, had disappeared. He had been fired. No formal announcement. No letter of appreciation. Not even a farewell. Yesterday, he was summoned to the principal's office. Principal Albert Granger, and 15 minutes later, he walked out in silence, carrying a worn cardboard box filled with a few notebooks, an old photograph, and his faded baseball cap. No one saw him off. No one intervened. The teachers stayed silent. Some even avoided the students' eyes. Those who used to share lunch with him, or ask him to fix a light or a broken locker door, now acted as if he had never existed. Ellen Martha stood quietly beside the lockers near the gym, eyes locked on the spot where Mr. Hensley used to rest each morning. "It's not right," she whispered, her voice filled with anger. "He didn't deserve this." Emma Morgan, Ellen's close friend, nodded slowly. "I heard the school's cutting the budget. They say he's too old. Not efficient anymore." "Too old?" Ellen clenched her fists. "He works harder than everyone here. If anyone deserves respect, it's Mr. Hensley." As the sound of lectures drifted from classrooms, a quiet wave of unrest spread through the students who had once been helped by him, those who saw him as more than just a janitor. He was part of the family. They didn't yet know that by tomorrow, something unimaginable would happen. Something that would force all of Stonebridge High to confront everything they had silently ignored. In the days following Mr. Thomas Hensley's disappearance from Stonebridge High's hallways, an eerie emptiness began to spread. Not through sound, but through absence. The gentle sweep of his broom each morning was no more. The low hum of old tunes he sang while cleaning the cafeteria was gone. And for the first time, students felt something they had never considered before. Mr. Hensley had never truly been acknowledged for his worth. Ellen Martha sat quietly in the library during lunch, a book open before her, but unread. She remembered the time Mr. Hensley had found her mother's bracelet left behind on the field and returned it to her personally. She remembered how he had handed her a paper towel when she cried alone in the restroom over a bad grade and simply said, "Tomorrow's a new day, sweetheart. Every day is a new chance." Emma Morgan approached, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee from the vending machine. "I just heard maintenance has someone new starting next week," she said, placing 1 cup in front of Ellen. Ellen looked up, her eyes stinging. Someone new. Just like that. Like Mr. Hensley, with some worn-out tool they could just throw away. Emma nodded, his voice low. "Some of the teachers feel the same. But no one wants to speak up. Everyone's afraid of Principal Granger." "I'm not," Ellen said, exhaling sharply. She turned toward the window, her eyes resolute. "He deserves better. If the adults won't do anything, then the students will." Messages started spreading through student group chats. Old photos with Mr. Hensley. Heartfelt stories of the small, quiet ways he had helped. Fixing bikes, mending a broken backpack strap, slipping coins into the vending machine so someone wouldn't be embarrassed by not having enough money. A plan was forming. No protests. No chaos. Just a collective decision by the kids whose hearts had once been quietly touched by his kindness. They would make the school listen. They would make sure he was seen, no matter how late. What seemed like an ordinary Monday morning began with an extraordinary sound. A deep rumble echoed across the Stonebridge High campus, causing students and teachers alike to look up at the sky. In the distance, a sleek black helicopter descended onto the front lawn, right beside the weathered school sign. Windows rattled from the wind whipped up by the blades. Teachers stood frozen like statues. Students gathered quickly, phones out faster than blinking eyes. All eyes turned toward the helicopter door, slowly opening. A man stepped out. He wore a charcoal gray tailored suit, polished leather shoes, and a wristwatch that glinted in the morning sun. He didn't need an introduction. It was immediately clear. This man didn't belong to the world of rusty lockers and water-stained tiles. Ellen and Emma stood together at the front steps, eyes wide, hearts racing. "That's him," Ellen whispered. "Mason Ellison, the billionaire CEO of Ellison Tech." "No way," Emma muttered. "There's no way." Mason needed no security, no announcer. He strode straight toward Principal Granger, who had rushed out from his office, face flushed like a man caught red-handed. "You are," Clark stammered, struggling to mask his confusion. Mason cut him off, his voice cool and direct. "I'm here to see Thomas Hensley." The entire schoolyard seemed to hold its breath. "He no longer works here," Granger stammered. "We had a personnel adjustment." "Then I want to know where he is," Mason said, his eyes locked on the sweating principal. Silence. Then a small voice rose from the crowd of students. It was Elijah, a ninth grader. "Mr. Hensley lives in the Maple Ridge complex. Apartment 102. Mason nodded in thanks, to the student, not to Granger. Without another word, he turned and walked back to the helicopter. Ellen tightened her grip on Emma's hand. "We have to find out what's going on," she whispered. And before anyone could stop them, the two girls sprinted toward the open door of the chopper. They jumped in. The door closed, and all of Stonebridge High could do was watch. As a new chapter began in the most unexpected way, inside the luxurious cabin, the drone of the engine softened to a distant hum behind soundproof glass. Ellen and Emma sat quietly across from the man who, just minutes ago, had only existed to them as a face on financial news headlines. Mason Ellison sat with his arms folded, eyes fixed on the skyline through the window. Before he could say a word, Ellen inhaled deeply and spoke first. "I'm sorry we jumped onto the helicopter without permission," she said, her gaze steady on Mason. "But this isn't just about Mr. Thomas." Emma nodded, his voice small but firm. "He's family to us, not by blood, but by heart." Mason turned his gaze, finally settling on the two teenagers. Not judging, not angry, just quiet, listening. Ellen clenched her fists. "The day my mom died, Mr. Thomas was the first one at our house. He didn't say much, just brought a bag of bread and milk, then cleaned the yard. Nobody asked him to." Emma picked up the thread, his voice bright with emotion. "When my parents got divorced, I got bullied in the bathroom. Mr. Thomas walked in, handed me a towel, and sat with me. He didn't ask questions, didn't tell me to toughen up. He just stayed. That was enough." Mason looked at both of them for a long moment. His expression softened, his eyes shifting just slightly. "No one ever told me he still did things like that." Ellen nodded, her voice trembling but steady. "We got on the helicopter because I knew. If he once changed your life, then he's quietly changed ours too. And we needed to know if he's okay." Silence settled over the cabin like a breath being held. Finally, Mason gave a small nod. "Then stay," he said, his voice deepening. "Because this isn't just about gratitude. It's a reminder. The people we think are invisible, they're the ones holding the world together." After a long pause, Mason continued, his voice low and deliberate, like he was telling a story no one had ever heard. "I met Thomas when I was 14, Mason began. Back then, I was homeless, after my mother died of illness. No home, no family, not even a future." Ellen and Emma exchanged a glance. Mason's face remained composed, but there was an ache in his voice that had never fully healed. "I used to sleep behind the school supply shed," he said, eyes drifting to the window. "And Thomas was the first one who found me. I thought he'd call the cops, but he didn't. He handed me a cold sandwich, an old blanket, and said, "You're not trash. You just need a chance." Emma gripped the seat beside him. Ellen didn't blink. The story unfolding before them was nothing like they expected. "He didn't just feed me," Mason continued. "He showed me how to re-enroll in school, how to write a resume. He walked me to the used bookstore to borrow textbooks. And he fixed an old bike himself so I could get to my part-time job." He paused, turning to the two students. "If it weren't for Thomas Hensley, I wouldn't have survived that winter. I wouldn't have graduated. And I sure as hell wouldn't have built Ellison Tech." Ellen swallowed hard. "So you came back to repay him?" Mason nodded, his eyes quiet but resolute. "I made a promise that one day, when I had the power, I'd come back. And no one, not even Principal Granger, has the right to discard a man like Thomas Hensley." Outside the window, the streets of Maple Ridge came into view. The weather department building where Thomas lived stood just ahead. But this time, Mason wasn't coming alone. He was bringing memory, gratitude, and a promise that had never been forgotten. The modest house on the corner of Maple Ridge stood beneath the pale glow of the afternoon sun. The front yard was scattered with weeds. The paint on the walls peeled, and the sagging porch roof mirrored the weariness of the man inside. When Mason Ellison stepped off the helicopter, the expensive suit he wore did nothing to soften the gravity in each of his strides. Ellen and Emma followed, breathless. They had only ever seen Mr. Thomas Hensley in the halls of their school, and never imagined they'd see him like this. On the porch steps, Mr. Thomas sat quietly with a cold cup of coffee in his hands. He looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps, his aged, clouded eyes suddenly widening with disbelief. "Mason," he said hoarsely, rising to his feet. "Is that really you?" Mason nodded and stepped forward. "I promised you, Uncle Thomas, one day I'd come back." No words could span the 30 years that had passed. There was only the embrace, tight, unfiltered, between an old man and the man he had once saved. It washed away the years in a wave of quiet, unspoken gratitude. Ellen wiped at her eyes. Emma turned away slightly, his voice tight. "This feels like something out of a movie." After the moment passed, Mason reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder. He placed it gently into Thomas's hands. "I didn't come empty-handed. This is a contract, a position of honor at Ellison Tech title, Corporate Culture Advisor. Your job is to help us build a workplace with heart, the same way you taught me all those years ago." Thomas looked down at the folder, hands trembling. "Mason, I'm past my time. I'm nobody now." Mason cut him off, firmly. "You're the reason I'm here. And now, it's my turn to give that chance back to you, and everyone else like you." A breeze passed through the porch. Dry leaves rustled beneath their feet. Thomas looked at the two students behind Mason, then back at the man he once helped. A flicker of a smile trembled on his lips. "I thought the world had forgotten me." Mason smiled and gently rested a hand on his shoulder. "The world might forget, but those you've touched never will." And in that weathered house, on a forgotten street, a door opened, not just for Thomas Hensley, but for a dream that had finally awakened. Just as Mr. Thomas reached for the pen to sign the contract, a loud, jarring sound shattered the calm, the slam of a car door in the driveway. The group turned. A sleek black SUV had screeched to a stop at the curb. Out stepped Principal Albert Granger, his face red with fury, as if he had been waiting for this moment far too long. "You can't just leave like this," Granger bellowed, storming past Ellen and Emma without so much as a glance toward Mason. "Stonebridge High needs you. This move of yours, this stunt, will damage the school's reputation." Thomas rose slowly to face Granger, his expression calm. But behind his eyes a fire blazed. "You need me," he repeated, voice low and steady. "Then tell me, when did the school ever need me in the last 30 years? That decision came from the board," Granger blurted, shooting a nervous glance at Mason. "I didn't know things had gone this far. But if Mr. Hensley is willing to return, I'm sure we can negotiate something." Mason folded his arms, his gaze cold as steel. "You're not worried about the school, Mr. Granger. You're worried the entire town's about to find out you fired the one man who should have had a statue built in his honor." Granger opened his mouth to argue, but a sharp electronic hum cut through the air from the edge of the driveway. Ellen raised her phone high. The live stream was still rolling. Comments poured in. The view count was climbing by the second. "He's not invisible anymore," Ellen said clearly, her voice ringing with quiet power. "The whole world's watching now." Granger paled. He glanced at the phone screen, then at Mason, as if silently pleading for rescue. Thomas stepped forward, voice warm but unwavering. "I've spent my whole life in silence, cleaning up after others, ignored, overlooked. But today, I refuse to be invisible any longer." The silence that followed was thick, unshakable. Granger stood frozen. Mason gave a small approving nod. "Mr. Granger," Mason said, stepping beside Thomas, "if you still have any sense of dignity, you'll leave quietly, just like how you let Mr. Hensley go." And so, on a quiet afternoon on Maple Ridge Street, a man who had once been treated as invisible stepped fully into the light, not with bowed head or apologies, but with the weight of truth and a lifetime of dignity behind him. For the first time in 30 years, he knew he was seen. As Principal Granger's SUV turned the corner and disappeared down the street, silence lingered in its wake. Thomas remained by the curb of Maple Ridge, as if marking the end of an era. One chapter closed. Mason turned to him, then to Ellen and Emma, the two young voices who dared to speak up. He walked to the back of the SUV, opened the trunk, and pulled out a large, color-printed design. He laid it across the hood and waved everyone over. "I didn't just come to bring Mr. Hensley back," Mason said, his tone solemn. "I came to build something bigger, a new kind of school. Not a place where kids are judged by their background, the color of their skin, or test scores, but one where education is built on compassion, justice, and equal opportunity." Thomas frowned slightly as he leaned in to examine the architectural design. The building was sleek and modern, with open gardens, glass-wall classrooms, and a bold phrase emblazoned across the front lobby. "No child invisible. You won't be a janitor anymore," Mason said slowly. "I want you to be one of the co-founders. I want students to look at you and understand that kindness is a guiding strength, not a weakness." Thomas gripped the edge of the design blueprint, his eyes rimmed with red. Ellen spoke softly. "What will the school be called?" Mason smiled, then turned to look at Thomas. "It'll be named after the first person who ever taught me to believe in myself. Thomas Hensley Academy." All three stood frozen. Thomas took a step back, his voice trembling. "My name. Not because you need recognition," Mason said, "but because these kids need a real role model." Just then, Ellen's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her mouth dropped open. "What is it?" Emma asked. "The live stream. It's at almost 300,000 views," she said breathlessly. "And the local news just reposted the entire thing." Thomas looked at Mason, his eyes no longer dulled by time and disappointment, but lit with a fire no one had seen in years. "Then let's begin," he said, steady and sure. "If I have a chance to change a child's life the way I once changed yours, I won't turn it down." Mason nodded. "The world's about to witness what Stonebridge High never saw. You were never invisible." And just like that, on the quiet street where he had lived in silence for 3 decades, Thomas Hensley stepped into his new role, sower of seeds for a more just generation. News of Thomas Hensley Academy spread like wildfire on a summer breeze. Within 24 hours, social media exploded with posts. From the viral live stream of Principal Albert Granger being publicly confronted by billionaire Mason Ellison, to the photo of Thomas smiling beside the blueprint bearing his name. Hashtags like #JusticeForThomas and #Hensley Academy shot to the #1 spot across North Carolina. Meanwhile, inside the office of Stonebridge High's principal, Albert Granger sat frozen in front of his computer screen. The pale blue glow reflected on his sweat-slicked face. Emails poured in, furious parents, media requesting interviews, and most damning of all, a formal summons from the school board demanding an emergency meeting. One email subject line stood out among the rest. You discarded a man, and now an entire school pays the price. Granger slammed his fist against the desk. The fountain pen on top bounced once, then clattered to the floor. Kids, an old janitor, and some silver-tongued showman, he muttered through clenched teeth. On the other side of town, in a world far removed from Granger's crumbling authority, Mr. Thomas Hensley sat in a temporary office at the Ellison Tech headquarters. He wore a crisp new button-down shirt and a wristwatch gifted to him with a small inscription on the back, to the one who inspired. Mason walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. Getting used to it yet? He asked with a smile. Thomas let out a soft laugh. I never imagined I'd be here, being called a director of community education. You earned it, Mason replied. And the man who threw you out, he's drowning in resignation demands. Thomas paused, then shook his head. I don't need him to pay a price. I just wanted to stop being overlooked. Mason nodded. Then you've already won. That afternoon, as Thomas stepped outside the headquarters, a small group of students and parents waited near the steps. A little girl came forward and handed him a drawing. It showed Mr. Thomas standing in the middle of a schoolyard, surrounded by smiling children. At the bottom, scrawled in red crayon, "Thanks for seeing us when no one else did." Thomas bowed his head, unable to hide the tears glistening in his eyes. Back at Stonebridge High, Principal Granger sat alone in his office. Knocking echoed faintly at the door, but no one answered. He stared out the tall glass window overlooking the schoolyard, now silent and empty. And for the first time in years, he felt what it was like to be invisible. 1 month after the launch of Thomas Hensley Academy, Mr. Hensley's name appeared on the evening news broadcast in Greenville, and soon after, on national outlets. Headlines dubbed him the man who rose from the shadows, and Southern Legacy magazine honored him as Education Icon for Equity 2025. But for Mr. Thomas, the most moving moment wasn't the awards or headlines. It was the look in the children's eyes as they stepped into their first class at the academy. The scent of fresh paint still clung to the walls. Kids from every walk of life sat side by side. No designer uniforms, no walls between rich and poor. Only a shared eagerness to learn. At the inauguration of the school's main lecture hall, now officially named Resilience Hall, Thomas stood on stage gripping the microphone tightly. His heart pounded as he looked out at the packed auditorium. Hundreds of students, parents, teachers, and reporters had their eyes on him. But this time, he didn't lower his gaze. There was a time, he began, his voice low and steady, when I thought my life's purpose was to sweep dust and disappear quietly at the end of each shift. That my voice mattered less than the sound of the final bell. He paused, catching sight of Ellen and Emma waving from the crowd. But I learned something, he continued. Not all change begins with power. Sometimes it begins with kindness. A meal given to a hungry kid, a word of encouragement to a student on the verge of giving up. I used to be a janitor, but now I have the chance to be the gatekeeper of a new generation. The applause was thunderous. Some stood, others wiped tears. That night, back at home, Mr. Thomas stood silently before the mirror by the door. The man reflected back at him no longer bowed his head. His hair was white, his back still a little bent, but his eyes shone, not from glory, but from a quiet certainty that he had finally reclaimed himself. From a man once dismissed by society, he had become a symbol of something simple yet profound. You can live a life in silence, but the moment you rise for what's right, the world will listen. That same afternoon, Thomas Hensley stood alone at the old basketball court behind Stonebridge High, the very spot where he used to sweep up after games, collecting soda cans left behind by students rushing home. Now the court had been fully renovated into a vibrant community center. A new plaque read, Thomas Hensley Court, for a kinder generation. A soft breeze ruffled his silver hair. Children's laughter echoed from afar. Kids who had once been invisible under the old system now finally had a place to belong. From behind, Jonathan King, once a homeless boy Mr. Thomas had quietly helped, walked over with 2 cups of sweet iced tea. He handed one to Thomas, his eyes warm with gratitude. "When I was a kid, I thought you were a superhero," Jonathan said, half joking. "Didn't wear a cape, but somehow you always showed up when it mattered." Thomas chuckled. "A superhero who sweeps hallways, huh? The real ones don't need spotlights," Jonathan replied. "Just a heart big enough not to turn away from someone else's pain." They sat side by side on the bench near the edge of the court, quietly watching the students run and laugh in the distance. No more words were needed, because in their hearts, one truth stood clear. Kindness, no matter how small, can shake an entire system, if given at the right moment, in the right way, and with a whole heart. That night, when Ellen sat down to write her sociology paper, she began with a single line. The world doesn't always need another great hero. Sometimes it just needs someone who's willing to see what others have learned to ignore. And at the very end, she quoted Mr. Thomas's words from the dedication ceremony. "No one is invisible if we're brave enough to see with our hearts."